Hey everyone, welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. Today I want to revisit the Matt Walsh, Joe Rogan discussion on so-called same-sex marriage. I'm not going to talk, though, about what Rogan and Walsh said to each other. I've covered that in a previous episode. Instead, I want to focus on a particular criticism that Matt Walsh has received from other Christians, specifically certain Protestant and Reformed Christians who have said that Walsh should not have defended marriage with a natural law kind of defense, but instead he should just have witnessed to Joe Rogan. He should have just evangelized and shared the gospel with Rogan and used that as a platform to talk about what marriage is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before I do that, though, I really want to thank everyone who supported the podcast. If you want to help us to continue to grow and to reach more people, definitely consider supporting us at trenthornpodcast.com. If you could also like this video and subscribe to it on YouTube or leave us a review on Apple iTunes on the podcast app, I would really appreciate it. That always helps us to reach more people. All right, so let's hop into today's episode. First, let me share with you two tweets that I saw that are representative of this kind of criticism that Walsh has received. So the first one comes from Peter Lightheart. He is the president of Theopolis. I believe he's a Presbyterian minister. I think he's Reformed, so he would fit within that denominational camp. And this is what he says. Christians are praising Matt Walsh for his Rogan interview because he didn't turn his defense of marriage into evangelism. I dissent. For Christians, marriage is the living icon of Christ and the church. Marriage is evangelical in its essence. And so in one respect, I agree with that marriage is a witness to the world of God's love for us. Paul in his letter to the Ephesians speaks about marriage being a mystery, how it parallels Christ and the church. So, I mean, the love a husband and spouse have for each other, Scott Hahn has written about this in his books on the subject of marriage, talking about how a married couple is somewhat a model of the Trinity, that the love they have for one another brings new life into the world, just as the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And so I agree. Marriage is an icon. It's representative of it can be representative of the Trinity. It can represent how the church is the bride of Christ, and so it does represent that. But it doesn't follow that the only way you can understand what marriage is if you already believe in Jesus. That you can't say, oh, well, people can only understand that marriage is the union of a man and a woman if they understand the analogy that Paul gives in his letter to the Ephesians. That's a fulfillment of it. But as I'll talk about more in this episode, marriage is a human universal. It's something that has been understood in essentially all cultures through all of human history, including cultures that had no knowledge of Jesus Christ whatsoever. But they had an understanding that it is just a part of human nature that society has an obligation to unite men and women to each other before they have children. And this is something that every society has faced, right? Think about this. When a baby is born, is it difficult to find out who the mother is? Throughout nearly all of human history, until like 5 minutes ago, the answer was no. It's obvious who the mother is. She's right there. She's a foot away from the baby after the baby is born. Nowadays, it can be hard because we have surrogacy, egg donors. We have bioethical nightmares when we separate the procreative act from the marital act. When we take procreation out of the marital act, and you get all these things where you can have a child literally has 4 or 5 parents. You can have a child who comes from an egg donor, a sperm donor, who is then implanted in a surrogate womb and is then adopted by a same-sex couple. So you can have children with, right there would be essentially like 5 parents that would be recognized. But throughout most of human history, when a baby is born, it's easy to figure out who mom is. She's right there. However, throughout most of human history, it's been a lot harder to find out who dad is. That can be a legitimate problem. Like, well, who is the father of this child? That's why we have things like the presumption of paternity. The idea that, okay, well, if a woman gives birth, we presume whoever she is married to is the father. That allows us to have stability in relationships. And the ideal is that before a man and woman become irreplaceable to a child who has a natural right to them, there needs to be something that makes them irreplaceable to each other, that unites them to each other before they're united to this child. And every culture has just figured this out, and it makes sense. And they've come up with marriage. So you can use natural reason to figure this out, even though divine revelation, Christ shows us that marriage is raised to the level of a sacrament. So it's funny, I see a lot of Protestants that talk about marriage almost as if it were a sacrament, but they can't bring themselves to say it, because many of them believe there's only two sacraments. Not all, but many. There are only two. That would be baptism and communion, or what they might call the Lord's Supper. So, and I'll talk more about this in general, but let me go to the next tweet. And that would come from James White. So here's what he says. Walsh's comments about defining and defending marriage are not surprising. There is a fundamental difference in how we Reformed do apologetics and how Rome does it. Well, the consistently Reformed, anyway. Walsh is your standard natural law type of guy. Go listen. Now, what's interesting here is just that notice that White qualifies this, saying how the Reformed do apologetics and Rome, or Catholics, the consistently Reformed, because there are many Reformed theologians who find the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, example, to be very helpful. So, for example, you have people like Paul Helm, who wrote the book Eternal God, A Study of God Without Time, defending the classical view that God is timeless. You have other Reformed thinkers who defend classical theism, like divine simplicity. I believe Dolezal is the author of the book on God Without Parts. I think he's Reformed also. But you can find many Reformed thinkers who use the arguments of natural theology to arrive at classical theism. And so they don't take what I think White would argue for, a presuppositional approach to apologetics, where they would just say that in order to have any kind of meaningful logical discussion, we have to presuppose that God exists, and not just God, but the triune God, the God of Christianity. We have to essentially presuppose that Christianity is true. And then from there, that's the only way we can know things, I guess, like that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. So what Walsh is saying here is, I guess, that the Reformed do apologetics through this presuppositional approach. Of course, not every Reformed person does that. Walsh would say only the real Reformed people do that. And that you shouldn't use these natural law types of arguments. And so we see this also, I've seen this approach from White in his discussions on other issues, like take the transgender issue. I'll play for you some clips of White on the Dr. Drew show defending a criticism of transgender ideology. So let me play a few of those clips and then I'll share my thoughts.
What we're hearing here is a fundamental clash of worldviews, and that's not really what we've gotten into a discussion of yet.
What's the clash?
I have to ask the question, what if Jesus was right when he said, have you not read from the beginning that God made them male and female? What if there's something really good?
James, I got to interrupt you. I have to interrupt you because I have patients that have something called an ovotesty. There's one thing together. They're hermaphrodites. I have patients that are mosaic hermaphrodites. I have people with ambiguous genitalia. What do I do with them? They're not perfect. They are messy. I barely have a penis.
Go ahead, James. Not true. The problem, of course, with that is that we are attempting to address an entire cultural issue on the basis of, well, you know, the percentages of what you just mentioned, and that's not the situation that we're talking about here.
One person has the right
I was asked
to believe what they want to believe.
And Christians believe that God has in fact spoken.
So that means that you want to become transgender. Wait a second, I'm Christian and I don't believe that. That's it.
Let me play host for a second. Host, hang on, host here.
I'm really concerned that I do not hear any discussion of the worldview issues that should give the foundation for any meaningful discussion of the subject. If we don't discuss the worldview that gives rise to our decisions, then all we're doing is giving our own personal opinions. That's not how you deal with societal issues.
First, I want to commend White for keeping the discussion on track and not allowing Dr. Drew to sidetrack it or to go down a rabbit hole. Because Dr. Drew is bringing up developmental abnormalities, chromosomal abnormalities. He's basically talking about intersex conditions where we're not sure if someone is a biological male or female. What do you do about that? When White is saying that Jesus said God made them male and female, and then Dr. Drew is saying, well, what about these intersex conditions? And White makes the valid point in the interview that in discussions of people like, say, Caitlyn Jenner, we're not talking about someone who is intersex. When we bring up the issue of transgender identity, it's very clear in 99.9% of these cases of people who identify as transgender, they're not intersex. They have a transgender woman has male genitals, XY chromosomes. It's abundantly clear. The only thing that's would say that they're female is their self-identification of that. And we could validly ask, is that wrong? But then White's central argument, though, is that, well, this is a worldview issue. The question of whether what makes someone a man or a woman, it turns on the Christian worldview. And so he brings it back to that instead of what I think would be effective is to ask, all right, well, what is a woman? You cannot even put forward a coherent definition. But if you look at this from just a perspective of reason, if you look at that perspective, you can see that it's unreasonable. We can see a natural order in the world ordered towards certain ends. So, male, female. And to reject this in your apologetic, I feel like this goes against the very thing the New Testament teaches, that if non-Christians cannot even understand what marriage is apart from divine revelation, well, then how do you make sense of what Paul writes in Romans 1 and Romans 2? Because in Romans chapter 1, Paul says that the Gentiles, even though they did not receive the Torah, they did not receive the Mosaic law, they still were under divine judgment because God can hold them accountable for sins like idolatry and homosexual behavior because they could have used the light of reason to understand you worship God, not an idol. Men have sexual relations with women, not other men. That the Gentiles could be held accountable for that, even if they didn't receive the Mosaic law. They had the law written on their hearts. Paul mentions that in Romans chapter 2, Romans 2, 14 through 16. He says that those who were not given the law on stone, the law was written on their hearts. And it says that on that day, the day of judgment, it will either accuse them or possibly excuse them. So God will judge someone based on the revelation that they're given. And that means that every person has been given a bare minimum amount of revelation to know that there is a God who created the world and man is made for him. Not every single person is going to be able to identify that. But the First Vatican Council taught infallibly that God's existence can be known by the light of human reason alone. Doesn't mean you can, by human reason alone, come to a relationship with God. Nobody can enter into a relationship with God except through God's grace, that we are free to either accept or reject, either at the beginning when he offers it or throughout our entire lives. That'll get us into Calvinism debates. We don't have time for that right now. But seeing White's argument here, saying, oh, well, Walsh, taking this example that the natural law view of marriage doesn't work because look at Walsh's interview. And as I said, look, I think Walsh was on the right track in the interview. He was just a little muddled in how he presented it. He wasn't going in there planning to debate so-called same-sex marriage. He was going to talk about his documentary, What is a Woman, and transgender issues. And I think this came up, and Walsh is not an expert in this area. He knows it, but he's not an expert. But I would say to someone like White, well, look at the excellent defenses of marriage we have from people like Ryan Anderson, Sharif Girgis, Robert George. We've got lots of people, even in the evangelical world, who make excellent natural law and philosophical arguments for the nature of the human person and for what marriage is. And we don't want to abandon that. And I would just say also, I understand where White's coming from, that you don't want to hide the gospel away. We should share the gospel. We absolutely should with every single person. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. But there's a time and a place. When you're in a personal conversation with someone talking about so-called same-sex marriage, you have freedom and latitude to then extend the conversation to talk about who gave us marriage, what God's plan is for it, how you can find hope in him in spite of disordered attractions or identities. But when you're in a media setting, it's different. So to give you another analogy, like take abortion. Are we unable to share the truth that abortion is wrong unless we bring the Bible into it? I wonder, I'm sure White would agree that we can show abortion is wrong apart from what the Bible teaches. Now, if I'm in a personal conversation with someone, I might get to the point where we'll ask, why do human beings matter at all? Why do human beings matter instead of other animals? Well, why do all members of the human species have equal rights? And then I would say, well, what best explains that is that God created human beings. He's the source of value, and he bestows value and intrinsic dignity on us. So that would be a point of conversation. I'd go there. But if I'm in a debate on a television show in a hostile audience, and I'm talking about abortion, I'm just going to show by reason alone, abortion is the killing of a human being. It's wrong. And then I might allude to that the Christian worldview makes sense of this. But I'm going to let people know you can be pro-life. You can believe abortion is wrong prior to accepting the Christian worldview. And that the Christian worldview will make, if you believe abortion is wrong, the Christian worldview makes more sense than an atheistic worldview to explain that fact. So in a media setting, I'm going to keep a very narrow target. If you expand it in a media setting to here's also the gospel, you'll just get shut down. You're not in an ideal place to share it. It's not a fair environment to do that. You want to pick your battles. Much the same way, if you're talking about marriage, I would make the point that by natural law, human tradition for thousands of years, we intuitively know what marriage is based on human nature. And then from there, I can say, well, where is the ultimate end of marriage? What is our ultimate end as human beings? And then I might segue into that into a personal conversation or allude to it in a media setting. So that's all I wanted to say today. I hope this is helpful. As I noted in my previous video on the Rogan Walsh discussion, if you want a good book on defending marriage in a post-Obergefell world where so-called same-sex marriage is essentially the law of the land. I don't know. The Senate might try to federalize it soon. I don't know. But maybe it'll happen by the time this episode airs. We'll see. If you want that, I'd recommend Ryan Anderson's book, Truth Overruled. I find that to be a very helpful book on this subject. So thank you guys very much. And yeah, I just hope you have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.